In the centuries that followed the Great War of 2077, when the United States was reduced to irradiated ruin and the bones of its cities lay half-buried beneath drifting ash, there emerged in the deserts of the Southwest a group of men and women who refused to surrender the idea of order. The Desert Rangers were born not from a single vault or surviving government, but from the scattered remnants of soldiers, sheriffs, and idealists who could not abide the lawless anarchy that consumed the post-war frontier. The first of them are said to have appeared in the early 22nd century, around the time when the fledgling settlements of Shady Sands and Junktown were taking their first steps toward recovery. The southwestern wastes, stretching across what had once been Nevada, Arizona, and the edges of California, were an unforgiving land of blistering heat, scarcity, and violence, where the collapse of civilization had left a power vacuum filled only by raiders, chemrunners, and desperate tribes competing over scraps of the old world. In that chaos, the Rangers emerged as self-appointed guardians, drawing on fragments of pre-war law enforcement tradition and the frontier ethos of the American Southwest, blending the mythology of the cowboy and the soldier into a new kind of order. They carried salvaged weapons and wore whatever armor they could find, but their most powerful weapon was the idea they represented, that justice could survive even after civilization's fall. Their early ranks included former servicemen of the U.S. Army, law enforcement officers who survived the nuclear exchange, and wanderers hardened by decades of exposure to the wastes. They took to the desert not for power or profit, but to restore something that had been lost: accountability, fairness, and the rule of law, no matter how limited its reach might be. The Desert Rangers' origins were not codified in any single founding document or charter. Rather, they evolved organically out of necessity. In Stronghold, those first decades, communication between settlements was tenuous at best, and isolation bred both independence and paranoia. Raiders roamed freely, slavers trafficked in human misery, and mutated creatures stalked the night. Where the major vault projects were sealed experiments in human behavior, the wasteland beyond them was an uncontrolled test of morality, and the Rangers became its most devoted subjects. They established scattered outposts in the remains of pre-war facilities, abandoned ranger stations, police precincts, and desert bunkers, and used these as waypoints for long patrols through the frontier. Oral tradition suggests that their first headquarters may have been established in the ruins of Nevada, possibly near what would later become Ranger Station Charlie, though other sources place their roots farther east, in the remains of Arizona's ranger lodges. Whatever the truth, their symbol, a five-pointed star, reminiscent of the pre-war sheriff's badge, became a mark of both fear and respect. To settlers, it meant protection; to raiders, retribution. They traveled lightly, often alone or in pairs, relying on the trust of locals for food, shelter, and intelligence. Their authority was not backed by any republic or army, but by reputation and resolve. They were bound by a simple creed that survived in word-of-mouth transmission: to protect the innocent, to punish the guilty, and to never abandon the code, even in the face of death. As settlements grew, so too did the Rangers' legend. They became walking myths, lone figures in dusters crossing endless salt flats, bringing justice where no law remained. They mediated disputes, broke up raider bands, and brought fugitives to improvised trials in towns barely held together by scavenged sheet metal and willpower. Though never numerous, their effectiveness lay in the psychological impact they carried. Raiders feared their sudden arrival. Communities celebrated their protection. In the absence of a functioning economy or government, the Rangers became an informal institution, and their presence helped stabilize key regions of the Mojave and the fringes of Arizona long before the new California Republic existed. Yet, the Rangers' code also bound them to a solitary and often fatal path. The wasteland was relentless, and for every settlement they defended, there were 10 more lost to famine, disease, or violence. Supplies ran low, and the line between survival and starvation was often razor-thin. Still, they endured, passing their training orally from veteran to recruit, keeping alive a martial discipline that emphasized marksmanship, endurance, and self-sacrifice. Their encounters with early tribal societies shaped their worldview. The tribes of the Southwest were diverse, some peaceful, some predatory, and some caught in the destructive wake of raider wars. The Rangers learned diplomacy as often as they learned to fight, forming alliances when possible and defending those who sought peace. They became known as impartial arbiters, their neutrality respected even among groups that otherwise warred. This impartiality, however, also meant isolation. Without a home settlement or a centralized leadership, the Rangers operated more as a brotherhood of like-minded individuals than as a formal army. Their numbers were small, perhaps no more than a few hundred at any given time, and attrition was constant. Yet, from this fragility arose a purity of purpose. They became the conscience of the desert, a reminder that humanity's capacity for honor did not perish with its cities. Over time, their methods evolved. They scavenged pre-war communication equipment to coordinate patrols, restored old ranger stations to act as listening posts, and began to document their encounters. Fragments of these records would later influence the NCR's bureaucratic structure of Ranger Command. But in these early years, documentation was secondary to survival. The Rangers functioned as a decentralized network, united not by hierarchy but by ideology. Each Ranger was expected to act independently, guided by personal judgment and moral conviction. When they met, they shared intelligence, supplies, and stories, some true, others exaggerated by retelling, but always reinforcing the same ideal, that civilization could only be rebuilt through integrity and sacrifice. The late 22nd century brought new challenges as the wasteland began to reorganize itself politically. Shady Sands had grown into a hub of commerce and governance, and the seeds of the new California Republic were beginning to sprout. The NCR's message of democracy, trade, and reconstruction appealed to many settlers, but it also threatened to absorb or marginalize smaller, independent organizations like the Desert Rangers. For the first time, the Rangers were confronted not only by raiders and slavers, but by ideology itself. The question of whether they should remain independent peacekeepers or become the enforcers of a rising republic's laws. To the NCR, the Rangers represented both potential allies and a threat to central authority. To the Rangers, the NCR represented the bureaucratization of justice they had fought to preserve in pure form. During this period, the Rangers fought some of their bloodiest battles in the unclaimed territories east of the NCR's frontier. They clashed with the Jackals and the Vipers, raider groups that terrorized trade routes and settlements, and paid dearly for every victory. Their numbers dwindled, and recruitment could not keep pace with losses. Yet, even as their influence waned, their legend grew. Tales of lone rangers holding off entire raider gangs became part of wasteland folklore. To many, they were ghosts, symbols of an older, nobler time. Some NCR citizens even viewed them as precursors to their own government's military, rangers, an unacknowledged lineage that the NCR would later claim as its own heritage. The Desert Rangers' reputation eventually reached Shady Sands, where NCR leaders recognized the value of their expertise. As the NCR expanded eastward, it adopted many of the Rangers' methods, patrolling, reconnaissance, and code of conduct, and integrated them into its own military doctrine. But in these earliest days, the Desert Rangers remained a separate, independent force, skeptical of politicians, but loyal to the principle of justice. Their equipment became more standardized as they traded with NCR caravans. Service rifles, revolvers, and salvaged combat armor replacing the patchwork gear of earlier generations. But their symbol, the star, endured unchanged. By the time the Mojave became a contested frontier, the Desert Rangers were already a dying breed. Their outposts were scattered, their leadership fragmented, and their resources stretched thin. Yet, the moral authority they carried was unmatched. Settlers still invoked their name for protection, and even the NCR's elite ranger divisions traced their traditions back to those early wanderers of the wasteland. Their story would eventually merge with that of the Republic, culminating in the Ranger Unification Treaty, a moment that would ensure their survival in form, if not in spirit. But before that unification, the Desert Rangers existed as the last guardians of an ideal born from apocalypse. That order could arise from chaos, not through dominance or fear, but through duty freely chosen. They were the inheritors of a broken nation's noblest virtues, the embodiment of a justice unmoored from any government yet anchored in the belief that humanity could still be redeemed. In the desolate silence of the post-war desert, where the winds carried the whispers of the old world's sins, the Desert Rangers stood as both witnesses and participants in the slow rebirth of civilization. They patrolled highways cracked by time, crossed ghost towns whose only inhabitants were memories, and lit campfires beneath the skeletal remains of pre-war billboards. Their presence, though fleeting, was transformative. Every settlement they defended became a seed for stability. Every raider they defeated a warning to others. The desert tested their resolve constantly, with thirst, with isolation, with moral compromise. But the code held. When asked why they fought, some rangers were known to answer simply, because someone has to. That sentiment, austere and unadorned, defined the essence of their order. By the dawn of the 23rd century, their numbers were few, but their influence immense. The NCR's rise would absorb their traditions and codify their tactics, yet the spirit of the Desert Rangers would linger like a ghost across the wasteland. A moral compass pointing west, toward the idea of civilization rebuilt not on power, but on principle. The Desert Rangers began as wanderers in a world that had forgotten law, and through their sacrifice, they ensured that law would one day return. Though history would fold them into the institutions of the new California Republic, their origin remained distinct, a testament to the stubborn endurance of justice in a world that had seen its end and refused to stay dead. The Desert Rangers, emerging from the charred remnants of post-war civilization, quickly established themselves not merely as armed enforcers, but as the bearers of a nascent moral order in a land where the concept of law had fractured under the weight of nuclear devastation, and where human survival often relied as much on cunning and resourcefulness as on sheer force of arms. In the southwest deserts of Nevada, Arizona, and the fringes of California, the Rangers confronted a reality where pre-war laws had become irrelevant relics. their authority reduced to the scattered memories of survivors who clung to old ideals, and where every settlement, no matter how small or improvised, required someone to impose fairness, settle disputes, and deter aggression, often without the benefit of written statutes or a centralized judiciary, leaving the desert rangers to codify their own rules of engagement and justice, rules which became known collectively as the law of the wastes. This informal, yet rigorous, system emphasized impartiality, restraint, and the protection of innocence, setting the rangers apart from the chaotic bands of raiders, slavers, and opportunistic warlords who roamed the desert. For while the latter groups wielded violence indiscriminately and often brutally, the rangers' power was defined not solely by their ability to harm, but by their reputation for measured judgment, strategic thinking, and an unwavering commitment to their creed, which demanded that they act not for personal gain, vengeance, or glory, but to uphold the fragile remnants of justice, a principle that often placed them at odds with both the desperate populations they served and the violent elements they sought to control, and required from each ranger a constant exercise of moral discernment in circumstances where there were no easy answers, and where every decision could mean life or death. The law of the wastes was neither written nor codified formally, but existed as an oral tradition and a set of widely understood norms passed down from veteran ranger to new recruit, a framework that emphasized key principles: the defense of those unable to defend themselves, the pursuit of criminals and raiders for the sake of community stability rather than personal vendetta, and the maintenance of order in a region where every day brought new dangers, from radioactive storms and mutated wildlife to raider ambushes and scarcity-driven conflicts among settlers themselves. Each ranger was expected to internalize these principles and apply them independently, relying on their judgment rather than awaiting directives, which required extensive training in reconnaissance, survival skills, and diplomacy, as well as rigorous moral discipline, since the isolation and unpredictability of the desert meant that decisions often had to be made alone, far from any backup or oversight, and the consequences were immediate, severe, and often irreversible. In practice, the law of the wastes manifested as a combination of physical vigilance and ethical conduct. Rangers patrolled highways and desert trails, inspected settlements for signs of raider activity or lawlessness, mediated disputes over water, land, and resources, and enforced their judgments through a mixture of intimidation, negotiation, and, when necessary, combat, always guided by the underlying belief that their authority stemmed from competence and character, rather than coercion or inherited power. This approach differentiated them sharply from other groups operating in the same territory, where power was frequently consolidated through fear, manipulation, or sheer numerical advantage, and where morality was a luxury few could afford, and allowed the rangers to cultivate a reputation for fairness and consistency, a reputation that, in turn, became their most effective tool for maintaining order, as raiders and hostile tribes alike learned to respect, or at least fear, the impartiality and relentlessness of the desert rangers. The rangers' reputation for integrity was reinforced by the symbolic elements they carried. The five-pointed star badge, salvaged or crafted from pre-war designs, served as a visual cue of their authority, while their uniform dusters, often reinforced with scavenged armor plates, communicated both readiness and restraint, signaling that these were figures committed to law, not chaos, and that violence, when used, was measured, targeted, and purposeful. Stories circulated among settlers and travelers of lone rangers confronting entire bands of raiders with nothing more than skill, courage, and the promise of justice, anecdotes that were retold and sometimes exaggerated, but that consistently reinforced the perception that the rangers were not mercenaries, but arbiters whose authority derived from moral legitimacy rather than brute force. This legitimacy was critical, because unlike a functioning government, the rangers lacked legal recognition from any sovereign authority. Their influence rested entirely on community consent and the demonstration of competence, which required constant attention, impeccable conduct, and strategic deployment of scarce resources, as well as careful judgment in determining when to engage adversaries and when to negotiate, for an indiscriminate application of force could undermine the very order they sought to preserve. In this sense, the law of the wastes was as much about restraint and ethical discernment as it was about action, a nuanced system that demanded both courage and wisdom from every ranger, and one that was passed down through mentorship, example, and the hard-earned lessons of battle and patrol. The early rangers' understanding of justice was shaped as much by the wasteland itself as by any moral philosophy. The environment tested endurance, adaptability, and ingenuity, forcing rangers to confront scarcity, exposure, and the ethical dilemmas of survival in a world where resources were limited and danger ubiquitous, cultivating a mindset in which the preservation of life, wherever possible, was paramount. Yet the enforcement of law required decisive, sometimes lethal action when necessary to protect the greater good. The practical application of the law of the wastes also extended to governance within settlements, where rangers often acted as impartial mediators in disputes ranging from territorial claims to trade disagreements, and sometimes even domestic conflicts, using a combination of negotiation, observation, and moral suasion to arrive at resolutions that balanced fairness and security, and which were respected precisely because the rangers were neither beholden to local factions nor motivated by self-interest, but by adherence to the shared principles of their order. Their interventions were informed by acute situational awareness, a deep knowledge of the region's geography and demography, and an understanding of human behavior shaped by decades of living on the margins of civilization. In many ways, the desert rangers functioned as proto-governors of the southwest wasteland, establishing order not through codified legislation or bureaucracy, but through a network of trust, reputation, and accountability that allowed disparate communities to coexist and survive amid chaos. They developed protocols for patrol routes, emergency response, and intelligence sharing, creating a decentralized system of governance that enabled them to extend their influence across vast territories despite their limited numbers, and ensured that even in areas far from established settlements, some measure of order could be maintained. Equally important to their enforcement of justice was the rangers' ability to communicate and coordinate across the harsh desert environment. They salvaged pre-war radios and signal equipment, maintained caches of supplies, and established rudimentary way stations where rangers could exchange information about threats, environmental hazards, and shifting patterns of migration among both people and raiders. This early network allowed them to act cohesively despite their independence, and facilitated the rapid deployment of aid to settlements under threat, further solidifying their reputation as impartial, reliable guardians. It also laid the groundwork for the NCR's later adoption of many ranger practices, demonstrating that even in the absence of formal government, effective administration could emerge from shared principles, disciplined organization, and commitment to a common code. In this context, the law of the wastes was not static. It evolved continually, shaped by experience, environmental pressures, and the emergence of new threats, from increased raider aggression to the encroachment of emerging factions like the proto-NCR, which introduced the challenge of balancing independence with cooperation, and local authority with the prospect of integration into a larger political entity. Perhaps most significant, however, was the ethical dimension of the Rangers' work. The post-war desert offered no easy choices. Sparing a criminal might endanger a settlement, while executing a wrongdoer could erode trust. Intervening in tribal conflicts could draw retaliation, while abstaining could be morally unacceptable. The Rangers' insistence on maintaining impartiality and moral consistency, even when costly, became their defining characteristic and cemented their place as an enduring model of principled enforcement in the harshest conditions imaginable. Over time, this approach became codified in the training and ethos of successive generations of Rangers, and ultimately served as the philosophical backbone for the new California Republic's Ranger Corps, whose members would inherit not only the Desert Rangers' tactical expertise, but also their unwavering commitment to justice, ethics, and accountability in a world where such concepts were perilously fragile. By the time the Desert Rangers were fully integrated into the NCR's expanding frontier, the law of the wastes had become both a practical guide and a moral touchstone. It defined their actions, their judgment, and their reputation, and it created a legacy that transcended individual lives, surviving as the principles upon which countless others would base their conduct in the Mojave and beyond. From patrolling empty highways and protecting isolated settlements to mediating disputes and engaging raiders in combat, the Desert Rangers' interpretation of law represented an extraordinary achievement: the establishment of functional order in a landscape defined by chaos, proving that even after civilization's collapse, justice, fairness, and ethical conduct could endure if men and women were willing to carry the weight of responsibility alone. With no government, no codified law, and no guarantee of success, their only guide the unwavering belief that some principles are worth preserving, even when the world itself has forgotten them, and that even in a wasteland, law need not be absent, but only embodied by those courageous enough to enforce it. The early decades of the Desert Rangers' existence were defined less by the establishment of order than by the constant struggle to assert it in a wilderness that seemed designed to resist it, a vast expanse of desert, canyon, and scorched earth stretching across Nevada and Arizona, where lawlessness thrived, where raider gangs multiplied like weeds in the absence of authority, and where every settlement faced threats both human and environmental that could destroy it in a single day. In this crucible, the Desert Rangers' identity as the guardians of the Southwest was forged through fire, blood, and relentless vigilance, and their legacy of resilience, strategy, and moral courage emerged from the countless confrontations they endured, confrontations that were simultaneously tactical exercises, moral tests, and existential trials. For, in the wasteland, the distinction between life and death often depended on a combination of skill, preparation, and ethical judgment, and the Rangers' adherence to their code in the midst of overwhelming chaos became the defining feature of their presence. Among the earliest and most notorious threats were organized raider bands, whose numbers, ferocity, and familiarity with the terrain made them formidable opponents even for the most skilled ranger. Groups such as the Jackals and the Vipers, mentioned in surviving NCR intelligence reports and oral histories, terrorized caravans, raided settlements, and maintained control over key trade routes, exploiting both the scarcity of resources and the isolation of communities, and compelling the Rangers to innovate constantly in order to counter their unpredictable tactics. The Rangers' methods combined mobility, intelligence gathering, and surgical strikes. Small patrols scouted the desert, observed enemy movements from hidden vantage points, and struck with precision, often employing ambushes, night raids, and tactical deception to overcome raider forces who might have outnumbered them 10-1, yet these engagements were rarely devoid of moral consequence, as the Rangers were constrained by their principles to limit collateral damage, to protect innocence, and to act as impartial enforcers rather than agents of revenge, a standard that distinguished them from the ruthless brutality that characterized much of the wasteland and contributed to the mythic status they would later achieve. While raider conflicts were the most immediate and visible threat, the Rangers also faced the complex dynamics of interaction with surviving tribal groups, some of whom were heavily armed, strategically sophisticated, and protective of their territories, and whose histories and grievances often predated the bombs themselves. In navigating these relationships, the Desert Rangers acted simultaneously as mediators, negotiators, and, when unavoidable, combatants, balancing respect for cultural autonomy with the need to prevent predatory behavior that could destabilize the fragile settlements under their protection. These encounters required a nuanced understanding of local geography, tribal politics, and human psychology, as well as the willingness to operate with incomplete information, often in conditions of extreme environmental stress, from punishing heat to sudden radiation storms, with limited supplies and no formal logistical support. The Rangers' ability to maintain order under these circumstances was a testament not only to their tactical acumen, but to the strength of the law of the wastes, their guiding code, which insisted that enforcement of justice was inseparable from moral responsibility, and that every action, whether negotiation or confrontation, carried consequences for both the living and the legacy of order in the desert. Among the most infamous episodes in the early history of the Rangers were the series of raids and skirmishes in Arizona, where raider factions had established semi-permanent encampments that threatened trade caravans and isolated settlements alike. Historical reconstructions based on NCR intelligence, survivor testimony, and environmental evidence indicate that these conflicts were often protracted campaigns lasting weeks or months, requiring careful reconnaissance, coordination among dispersed ranger units, and, frequently, innovative use of the harsh desert terrain to gain tactical advantage. Rangers employed a combination of direct engagement and psychological warfare, setting traps, employing signal fires to mislead raiders, and creating a perception of omnipresence that allowed small ranger contingents to influence the movement and behavior of much larger adversary groups. This blend of strategy and principle set the Desert Rangers apart from other armed groups of the wasteland, whose primary mode of operation relied on intimidation, theft, and opportunistic violence, rather than disciplined and ethical enforcement. In addition to combat, the Rangers' efforts often involved the reconstruction and protection of critical infrastructure, such as water sources, trade routes, and small defensive outposts, as well as the coordination of relief for settlements struck by famine, disease, or raider depredation. further solidifying their role as both military and civic actors in the desert. The moral and physical demands of these conflicts exacted a heavy toll. Recruitment was difficult, casualty rates were high, and the psychological strain of constant vigilance and exposure to violence left deep marks on those who survived. Despite these challenges, the Rangers cultivated a culture of mentorship and oral history, transmitting lessons learned from engagement with raiders, tribal coalitions, and the deadly environment itself to new members, ensuring that knowledge of tactics, ethics, and desert survival persisted, even as individual rangers were lost to age, injury, or death in battle. This process of knowledge transmission was crucial to maintaining continuity of purpose, as the decentralized structure of the Rangers meant that no single commanding authority could dictate action across the expanse of the Southwest, leaving the integrity of operations dependent on the character and judgment of individual Rangers adhering to a shared ethos. The persistence of the Rangers in these early conflicts established a standard of conduct that would later influence the organization, tactics, and ethical frameworks of the NCR Ranger Corps, providing a model for disciplined, principled enforcement under conditions of extreme adversity. The Desert Rangers conflicts also extended to the emerging power of the new California Republic, whose expansion into the Mojave and surrounding territories created new pressures, both logistical and ethical. While the NCR represented the possibility of stable governance, its increasing influence introduced political considerations that challenged the Rangers' independence, as decisions about intervention, collaboration, and territorial control became entangled with the ambitions of a centralized state. Some Rangers viewed integration with the NCR as a threat to their autonomy, while others recognized the strategic advantages of alignment, including access to resources, intelligence, and reinforcements. These internal debates shaped both the tactical posture of the Rangers and the evolution of their code, illustrating the adaptability of the law of the wastes in response to shifting political, environmental, and social realities, and highlighting the tension between principled independence and pragmatic cooperation in a world where survival often depended on alliances and negotiation as much as on combat proficiency. Environmental hazards further complicated the Rangers' operational challenges. The deserts of Nevada and Arizona were punctuated by irradiated zones, unstable terrain, and sudden climatic extremes, from blistering heat waves to flash floods, each of which could compromise patrols, settlements, or supply lines. Rangers developed specialized skills to navigate these conditions, including the identification of safe water sources, the construction of temporary shelters, and the use of terrain for defensive advantage, often integrating these environmental strategies into their broader tactical doctrine. Survival in the desert required not only physical endurance but also acute situational awareness, as even minor miscalculations could result in fatal exposure, encounters with mutated creatures, or vulnerability to ambush. These constant environmental pressures reinforced the necessity of discipline, foresight, and ethical judgment, as decisions made under stress could affect both the lives of civilians and the operational integrity of Ranger units, further embedding the interdependence of morality and effectiveness within the law of the wastes. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Desert Rangers' conflicts in the frontier was the way in which they established a culture of accountability and reputation-based authority. Raiders, settlers, and tribes alike recognized that the Rangers operated according to consistent principles, and this recognition became a force multiplier. The fear of measured, Unavoidable retribution often prevented conflicts before they could begin, as the presence or rumored presence of rangers influenced behavior across the desert. Stories of lone rangers standing against entire raider bands, defending remote settlements, or mediating disputes with impartiality became part of the oral history of the Southwest, reinforcing both the authority and mystique of the order. These narratives, passed down through generations, contributed not only to morale among rangers, but to the broader social fabric of the post-war frontier, demonstrating that even a small group of principled individuals could exert influence over a vast and chaotic landscape when guided by disciplined judgment, courage, and ethical consistency. As the 22nd century drew to a close and the NCR expanded its reach, the Desert Rangers' record of conflict provided both tactical and philosophical foundations for integration into larger military and civic structures. Their successes in navigating complex social, environmental, and martial challenges offered lessons in leadership, strategy, and ethics that were codified into training and doctrine, ensuring that the spirit of the original Rangers would persist even as organizational structures evolved. Ultimately, the conflicts of the frontier, bloody, chaotic, and morally complex, were the crucible in which the Desert Rangers' identity was forged, and they emerged not merely as survivors or warriors, but as exemplars of principled enforcement, capable of maintaining justice in a world bereft of law, and their legacy, carried forward by the NCR Ranger Corps and echoed in the tales of the Mojave, stands as a testament to the enduring power of discipline, ethics, and courage in the harshest conditions imaginable. As the Desert Rangers continued their tireless patrols across the harsh expanse of the post-apocalyptic Southwest, their survival and effectiveness were shaped as much by the complex network of relationships they maintained with neighboring groups as by their ability to combat raiders, mutated creatures, and environmental hazards. For the wasteland was not only a place of violence but also a mosaic of interdependent communities, wandering traders, emergent settlements, and nascent factions, each striving to secure resources, influence, and security in the absence of centralized governance. And in this fragmented landscape, the Rangers had to navigate alliances and rivalries with extraordinary care, balancing their commitment to impartial enforcement of the law of the wastes with the practical realities of survival, diplomacy, and strategic collaboration, knowing that a misstep in judgment could endanger not only themselves but the very settlements they sought to protect. These interactions were multifaceted, encompassing cooperative endeavors, tense standoffs, and occasional violent clashes, and they underscored the dual nature of the Rangers' mission as both moral arbiters and pragmatic actors within a complex socio-political environment where every action carried consequences far beyond the immediate outcome. One of the most significant categories of allies were the small, isolated settlements scattered across the deserts of Nevada and Arizona, often composed of survivors from pre-war towns, vault dwellers, or migrant groups who had claimed remote oases, abandoned military facilities, or partially intact towns as their homes, and who relied heavily on the Rangers for protection, guidance, and dispute resolution. These communities, though limited in manpower and resources, were critical nodes in the Rangers' operational network, providing intelligence on raider movements, safe passage through the desert, and essential supplies such as food, water, and ammunition, which were perpetually scarce in the frontier. And the mutual dependence that developed between the Rangers and these settlements created a form of social contract, reinforcing both the moral authority of the rangers and the community's willingness to adhere to the standards of order the rangers enforced, even in the absence of formal legal structures, thus creating pockets of relative stability in an otherwise chaotic and perilous landscape. The settlers themselves often contributed to the rangers' effectiveness by supplying knowledge of local terrain, customs, and tribal patterns, allowing ranger units to anticipate potential conflicts and to deploy interventions strategically, minimizing collateral harm while maximizing the deterrent effect of their presence. Beyond settlements, the rangers' interactions with other organized groups were more complex and fraught with both opportunity and danger. Some early militias and proto-factions, such as small regional militias in southern Nevada, sought to exert authority over territory and trade, sometimes overlapping with ranger patrol areas. In these cases, cooperation was occasionally possible, particularly when mutual threats such as raiders or rogue tribes presented a common enemy, but friction often arose from differences in priorities, codes of conduct, and methods of enforcement, and the rangers had to navigate these relationships with careful diplomacy, occasionally acting as mediators, occasionally asserting dominance, and always guided by the principle that the broader stability of the wasteland was paramount. Similarly, wandering traders, caravans, and scavenger groups presented both allies and challenges, while they facilitated the flow of goods, information, and occasionally recruits. Some were opportunistic, shifting loyalties and engaging in predatory behaviors that required ranger intervention, reinforcing the delicate balance between collaboration and enforcement that defined the rangers' operational ethos. Tribal groups presented another layer of complexity. As the deserts were home to a diverse array of post-war indigenous and semi-nomadic communities, some descended from pre-war populations, others formed in response to the collapse of central authority, and each with its own customs, leadership, and territorial claims. The rangers' approach to these groups was informed by both pragmatic necessity and the moral obligations embedded in the law of the wastes, recognizing that outright aggression could destabilize settlements and provoke long-term cycles of retaliation, while diplomacy and mutual understanding could secure long-term stability and even productive alliances through a combination of negotiation, shared patrols, and, when unavoidable, targeted conflict. The rangers sought to integrate these groups into a broader framework of order without erasing their autonomy, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of political ecology in the wasteland, and establishing a precedent for later NCR operations that would formalize relationships with tribal factions through treaties, trade agreements, and joint defense initiatives. Notably, the rangers' efforts to mediate between rival tribes and protect settlers often placed them in the center of ethically complex scenarios, forcing them to weigh the immediate needs of human populations against the rights and traditions of tribal communities, and reinforcing the principle that justice in the wasteland required not only courage and firepower, but also judgment, empathy, and adaptability. The emergence of the new California Republic on the western horizon added a new dimension to the Rangers' network of allies and rivals, as the Republic's expansionist policies began to intersect with Ranger territories, introducing both opportunities for cooperation and sources of tension. The NCR recognized the strategic value of the Rangers' knowledge, experience, and local authority, and early interactions involved exchanges of information, joint operations against raider bands, and discussions about the potential integration of ranger units into the Republic's nascent military and administrative structures. However, this relationship was never straightforward, as some rangers viewed the Republic's centralizing tendencies with skepticism, concerned that integration would compromise the moral independence and operational flexibility that had defined their order for decades, while NCR leaders saw the Rangers' autonomy as both a liability and a potential asset, depending on how effectively it could be harnessed to support broader territorial ambitions. The tension between maintaining principled independence and collaborating with a growing political entity exemplified the strategic and ethical dilemmas that the Rangers faced in a frontier environment where alliances could shift as quickly as the desert sands, and where the line between ally and adversary was often fluid. Conflicts with rivals, meanwhile, were not limited to raiders and rogue militias. They also included the often unpredictable dynamics of settler factions competing for resources, the occasional encroachment of proto-NCR outposts seeking to extend influence, and the delicate balance of power among tribal groups, all of which required the Rangers to exercise both military acumen and diplomatic skill simultaneously. Their interventions were guided by consistent principles, yet required flexibility in execution, as rigid adherence to doctrine could exacerbate tensions, while neglect of ethical standards could undermine credibility and authority. In this way, the Desert Rangers exemplified the intricate interplay between moral philosophy, tactical expertise, and environmental awareness, demonstrating that effective enforcement in a post-apocalyptic landscape depended not solely on martial skill, but on the capacity to navigate complex social networks, assess risk, and apply judgment consistently under conditions of uncertainty. The Rangers' legacy in managing relationships with allies and rivals extended beyond immediate tactical outcomes, influencing the development of social cohesion, economic stability, and political frameworks in the early post-war Southwest. Their role in mediating disputes, coordinating mutual defense, and establishing norms of conduct helped prevent the total collapse of settlements, facilitated the flow of trade and communication, and provided models of governance that could be scaled as larger entities like the NCR expanded eastward. By combining impartial enforcement with strategic collaboration, the Desert Rangers created conditions under which emerging communities could survive and prosper, reinforcing the notion that law, order, and ethical conduct could endure even in a world stripped to its most basic survival imperatives. In the final analysis, the Desert Rangers' interactions with allies and rivals were a defining aspect of their history, shaping not only their operational effectiveness, but also their enduring moral and cultural identity. Their ability to maintain credibility, exercise judgment, and balance competing interests ensured that the deserts of Nevada and Arizona remained navigable, survivable, and, to the extent possible, just, laying the groundwork for subsequent generations of NCR Rangers and establishing a legacy of principled enforcement, strategic diplomacy, and ethical resilience that continues to inform the understanding of law, order, and human interaction in the harshest environments of the post-apocalyptic world. The relationships they forged, the rivalries they navigated, and the moral frameworks they upheld collectively illustrate the depth and sophistication of the Desert Rangers' approach to a lawless frontier, confirming that their influence extended far beyond the immediate outcomes of individual patrols or battles, and into the very structure of post-war civilization. The emergence of the new California Republic in the decades following the initial post-war recovery represented a critical turning point not only for the territories of the West Coast, but also for the independent actors who had maintained pockets of stability throughout the wasteland. Chief among them, the Desert Rangers, whose operations in the deserts of Nevada and Arizona now intersected with a rising political entity whose ambitions would shape the future of the Southwest. For the NCR was born from the remnants of Shady Sands, a settlement founded by survivors who sought to re-establish governance, trade, and collective security in a world that had forgotten centralized authority, and it rapidly evolved into a republic with formalized institutions, a growing bureaucracy, and a military force intent on expanding its borders, thereby creating both opportunities and challenges for the Rangers, who had long operated as autonomous enforcers of the law of the wastes, and whose survival, influence, and operational philosophy were rooted in decentralized, principled independence rather than allegiance to any political entity. The shifting frontier, as historians and in-game reconstructions describe it, was defined by the gradual extension of NCR authority eastward, as the Republic sought to secure trade routes, protect settlements, and assert its sovereignty over previously lawless territories, a process that inevitably brought the NCR into contact with the Desert Rangers, whose patrols, outposts, and moral authority represented both a potential resource and a possible obstacle, depending on the perspective of NCR leaders and the willingness of individual Rangers to cooperate. For while the Republic valued order, stability, and the integration of effective local actors into its expanding bureaucracy, the Rangers had developed a code, operational doctrine, and social legitimacy that had evolved over decades in a wasteland that the NCR had not yet controlled. And these elements could not simply be absorbed without negotiation, adaptation, or compromise. The early encounters between the Desert Rangers and the NCR were complex and multifaceted, involving reconnaissance, information exchange, and cautious coordination as both parties evaluated the capabilities, intentions, and cultural norms of the other. Rangers provided the Republic with invaluable intelligence on raider activity, tribal movements, and the environmental challenges of the desert, while NCR scouts and officials introduced the Rangers to the emerging structures of Republican governance, trade networks, and military organization, illustrating the potential for symbiotic collaboration, yet also highlighting the tensions inherent in aligning a decentralized, principle-driven order with a growing centralized state whose priorities might diverge from the moral imperatives that had long guided Ranger activity. The philosophical and operational divergence between these two entities became particularly evident in disputes over jurisdiction, resource allocation, and the enforcement of justice, as the NCR's expanding legal framework and territorial claims sometimes conflicted with the Rangers' long-standing practice of impartial adjudication and localized autonomy, creating friction that had to be navigated with care, diplomacy, and strategic judgment, for missteps could result in destabilized settlements, lost credibility, or violent confrontation with hostile groups that both parties sought to suppress. The shifting frontier was characterized not merely by territorial expansion but also by the fluid interplay of authority, legitimacy, and cultural influence. And the Desert Rangers' role in this dynamic was both proactive and reactive. They continued to patrol remote regions, enforce the law of the wastes, and mediate disputes among settlers and tribes, Yet they now had to account for the growing footprint of NCR forces, whose presence could either bolster or complicate ranger operations, depending on circumstance, and whose expanding reach prompted rangers to evaluate their long-term strategic goals, operational doctrines, and ethical obligations in light of the evolving political landscape, a process that required careful balancing of principle, pragmatism, and foresight. For the NCR, the Desert Rangers represented a repository of practical knowledge, battlefield experience, and moral authority, offering a template for disciplined frontier enforcement, and their integration, whether voluntary or coerced, would ultimately become essential to the Republic's ability to secure contested territories, maintain order, and project legitimacy in regions where centralized control remained tenuous, and resistance, both human and environmental, was constant and unpredictable. The Desert Rangers' perspective on the shifting frontier was shaped by their deep commitment to moral independence, operational flexibility, and community-centered enforcement. While they recognized the benefits of coordination with a growing political power, including access to supplies, reinforcements, and broader strategic influence, they were acutely aware that submission to centralized authority could compromise the ethical and practical foundations of their order, diminishing the very qualities that had allowed them to establish order where none had existed, and potentially undermining the trust that settlers and allied groups had come to place in their impartiality, judgment, and courage. This tension between autonomy and integration would dominate the Rangers' strategic calculus in the decades leading up to their eventual formal merger with the NCR Ranger Corps, as they navigated an increasingly complex frontier where political, environmental, and social factors intersected to produce both unprecedented opportunity and existential risk, and where the survival of communities and the enforcement of justice were contingent upon the ability to maintain credibility, consistency, and moral authority in the eyes of a diverse and often volatile population. During this period, the Rangers engaged in extensive patrols and strategic operations along emerging NCR routes, protecting caravans, securing trade corridors, and intervening in disputes that could have escalated into broader conflicts, all while maintaining their decentralized command structure and adherence to the law of the wastes. These activities demonstrated both the operational effectiveness and the philosophical resilience of the Rangers, as they were able to adapt to the presence of a nascent republic without surrendering the principles that had guided their actions for decades, thereby ensuring that their influence persisted, even as the political and military landscape of the Southwest evolved rapidly, and that their expertise and ethical framework would inform the Republic's approach to frontier governance, law enforcement, and military training for generations to come. The reciprocal relationship that developed between Rangers and the NCR during the shifting frontier period laid the groundwork for formalized cooperation, while also preserving the core identity of the Rangers as autonomous moral agents, capable of navigating the challenges of a rapidly changing wasteland with both strategic acumen and ethical clarity, and providing the Republic with a model for disciplined, principled enforcement that would become foundational to its military and civic structures in subsequent decades. The shifting frontier also highlighted the strategic importance of environmental knowledge, as the Desert Rangers' intimate familiarity with desert terrain, water sources, irradiated zones, and the migratory patterns of raider bands and tribal groups became critical to NCR planning and expansion. Their ability to interpret the landscape, anticipate threats, and execute operations in extreme conditions provided a template for integrating localized expertise into a broader framework of territorial governance, demonstrating that centralized authority, while valuable for coordination and logistics, required the insight, judgment, and ethical grounding of independent actors to be truly effective in regions where the wasteland itself remained the most formidable adversary. Furthermore, the moral credibility of the Rangers in dealing with settlers, traders, and tribal groups facilitated smoother transitions of authority, as communities that had come to rely on the Rangers' impartial judgment and enforcement were more receptive to NCR governance when it respected the traditions and standards established by the Rangers, illustrating the long-term value of principled autonomy in stabilizing contested frontier regions. The shifting frontier period, therefore, was not merely a story of political expansion but a complex interplay of ethics, strategy, and adaptation, in which the Desert Rangers played a pivotal role as both enforcers and exemplars, maintaining continuity of law, order, and moral authority while interacting with a nascent political power whose growth would ultimately define the future of the Southwest. The decisions made during this era, the alliances forged, and the principles upheld by the Rangers shaped the trajectory of the NCR, influencing its military doctrines, administrative structures, and approach to civil-military relations, and ensured that the spirit of the Desert Rangers, characterized by courage, judgment, and ethical consistency, would endure even as their independent operations gradually became absorbed into the broader framework of the Republic, leaving a legacy that bridged the chaotic wilderness of the post-war desert and the institutionalized order of a rising state, and cementing their place as both historical actors and moral exemplars in the narrative of the wasteland's reconstruction and governance. The Arizona campaigns represent one of the most significant periods in the operational history of the Desert Rangers, a series of coordinated actions and prolonged engagements that not only tested the tactical, logistical, and moral capacities of the Rangers, but also defined their reputation as the most effective enforcers of order in the harsh post-apocalyptic Southwest. For the deserts and canyons of Arizona were home to a multitude of threats that required unprecedented adaptability and strategic innovation, ranging from highly organized raider gangs such as the Jackals and the Vipers, to predatory tribes, nomadic slavers, and opportunistic warlords who sought to exploit the absence of centralized authority, and from the unforgiving environment itself, with blistering heat, radiation pockets, and sudden flash floods, to the logistical challenge of coordinating supply lines across vast stretches of desert and mountains. The Arizona campaigns, which took place in the decades following the initial rise of the Desert Rangers and coincided with the early expansion of the new California Republic, demanded a comprehensive understanding of terrain, human psychology, and frontier ethics, as well as an unwavering commitment to the law of the wastes, the moral code that guided the Rangers' operations, and ensured that even in the midst of constant danger, their interventions were grounded in principle rather than opportunism or vengeance. These campaigns were not singular battles or isolated skirmishes, but a continuous series of military, diplomatic, and logistical operations designed to stabilize the region, protect settlers, secure trade routes, and mitigate the destructive impact of raiders and hostile factions, often requiring the Rangers to operate in small, highly autonomous units that could cover vast territories, respond rapidly to emerging threats, and make independent judgments on the use of force, negotiation, and restraint, all while maintaining the trust of local communities, allies, and neutral factions whose cooperation was essential to sustaining influence over the contested deserts of Arizona. The challenges faced during the Arizona campaigns were compounded by the highly fluid social and political environment of the region, where settlements were frequently isolated, tribal allegiances shifted unpredictably, and raider groups adapted rapidly to ranger tactics, exploiting weaknesses and testing the limits of ranger authority. In this context, the desert ranger's ability to gather intelligence, assess risk, and implement coordinated responses became critical to both tactical success and strategic stability, and their operations were marked by a sophisticated blend of reconnaissance, deception, targeted strikes, and community engagement, reflecting an understanding of warfare that was inseparable from the ethical imperatives of the law of the wastes, which dictated not only how they fought, but also how they engaged with civilians, neutral parties, and even adversaries, emphasizing proportionality, impartiality, and the protection of non-combatants in an environment where the line between survival and lawlessness was dangerously thin. The Arizona campaigns thus served as both a proving ground and a crucible for the Desert Rangers, shaping the evolution of their tactics, operational doctrines, and ethical frameworks, while simultaneously demonstrating to emerging political entities such as the NCR the value of disciplined, principle-driven frontier enforcement in a landscape that defied conventional governance. Among the most notable operations of the Arizona campaigns were the systematic efforts to disrupt raider supply lines and dismantle their strongholds, often located in naturally defensible positions within canyon systems, abandoned pre-war settlements, and makeshift fortifications constructed from salvaged materials. These missions required meticulous planning, precise execution, and a deep understanding of desert survival, as rangers needed to navigate treacherous terrain, manage limited water and ammunition, and anticipate ambushes while maintaining operational security and minimizing exposure to radiation and environmental hazards, all of which demanded both individual skill and collective coordination within ranger units, demonstrating the high degree of professionalization and discipline that had evolved within the Order over decades of continuous operation. The successful execution of these campaigns not only neutralized immediate threats to settlements and trade routes, but also established a pattern of deterrence, as the demonstrated capacity of small, highly skilled ranger teams to inflict decisive punishment on raider factions created a psychological effect that extended far beyond the battlefield, reducing future attacks and stabilizing vast regions of the desert. In addition to their military operations, the Desert Rangers engaged in extensive diplomacy during the Arizona campaigns, negotiating with tribal factions, independent settlements, and even opportunistic warlords to create temporary alliances, mediate disputes, and prevent escalation of localized conflicts into broader, more destructive confrontations. These efforts required an acute understanding of human behavior, cultural norms, and strategic incentives, as well as a willingness to employ both persuasion and deterrence in order to achieve outcomes that aligned with the broader objectives of maintaining order and protecting innocence, and reinforced the central tenet of the law of the wastes, that moral judgment and ethical consistency were as critical to effective enforcement as tactical prowess and logistical competence. The Rangers' dual role as both warriors and moral arbiters allowed them to operate in situations where conventional military forces would have struggled, and their success in this domain cemented their reputation as indispensable actors in the stabilization of the Southwest, influencing both contemporary settlement patterns and the operational doctrines of the emerging New California Republic, which increasingly sought to incorporate Ranger expertise into its expanding military and civil infrastructure. The logistical complexity of the Arizona campaigns cannot be overstated. Rangers had to maintain supply caches, secure safe routes for caravans, and ensure rapid communication across vast distances, often relying on pre-war technology scavenged from ruined infrastructure, improvised signal systems, and trusted couriers drawn from both Ranger units and allied communities. These capabilities allowed the Rangers to respond to threats with speed and precision, despite being numerically inferior to many raider groups, and underscored the importance of adaptability, resourcefulness, and coordination in operating within a frontier environment where both geography and human behavior presented constant uncertainty. The campaigns also served as an incubator for innovation in equipment, tactics, and survival strategies, as Rangers developed specialized methods for desert navigation, camouflage, ambush tactics, and small unit engagement that would later inform the training and operational standards of NCR Ranger units, ensuring that the lessons learned during these campaigns had enduring institutional impact. The human cost of the Arizona campaigns was significant, reflecting both the intensity of the engagements and the harshness of the environment. Rangers faced high casualty rates, extreme fatigue, and the psychological toll of sustained conflict, yet the culture of mentorship, discipline, and oral history ensured that knowledge, experience, and ethical principles were transmitted effectively to new recruits, maintaining operational continuity and preserving the integrity of the law of the wastes, even as individual participants were lost to the unforgiving conditions of the desert or to combat itself. These sacrifices reinforced the ethical dimension of Ranger operations, as every decision to engage, negotiate, or withhold force carried weight not only for the immediate outcome but for the broader perception of justice and authority in the frontier, emphasizing the intertwined nature of moral judgment, operational competence, and social legitimacy that defined the Desert Rangers' approach to the Arizona campaigns. Ultimately, the Arizona campaigns illustrate the Desert Rangers' capacity to impose a measure of order, security, and ethical governance in a landscape characterized by fragmentation, danger, and uncertainty, and they represent a crucial chapter in the development of both the Rangers' operational doctrine and their enduring legacy, as the experience gained, relationships forged, and moral authority exercised during these campaigns laid the groundwork for subsequent integration with the new California Republic, informed the training and culture of NCR Ranger units, and provided a model for disciplined, principled frontier enforcement that has resonated throughout the post-war Southwest, demonstrating that even in the most inhospitable environments, law, justice, and ethical governance could be upheld by those willing to endure hardship, exercise judgment, and maintain unwavering commitment to principles forged in the ashes of civilization. The Ranger Unification Treaty stands as a watershed moment in the history of the Desert Rangers, marking the transition from independent frontier enforcers to integrated components of a formal state apparatus under the banner of the new California Republic, a merger that was neither inevitable nor simple, For decades of autonomy had instilled in the Rangers a fierce pride, a moral independence, and a set of operational doctrines honed through the harshest deserts, brutal skirmishes with raiders and warlords, and the unrelenting demands of survival, all of which had produced a reputation and authority that extended across the Southwest and commanded respect from settlers, traders, and even some adversaries. And yet, by the late 22nd century, the realities of dwindling manpower, the expanding influence of the NCR, and the increasing logistical demands of holding vast territories forced the Rangers to consider integration as a means of preserving both their legacy and the safety of the people they had long protected. The negotiations that culminated in the treaty were protracted and tense, involving careful deliberation over command structures, operational independence, the preservation of the Desert Rangers' ethical code, and the practical realities of supplying, equipping, and supporting units across hostile desert terrain, as NCR officials sought to formalize the Rangers' capabilities into a centralized force, while the Rangers insisted on retaining elements of their decentralized decision-making, moral autonomy, and the flexibility that had allowed them to operate effectively for decades. A process that required compromise on both sides and a mutual recognition of shared values, including the prioritization of civilian protection, ethical enforcement of law, and disciplined, principled engagement in conflict. And while some Rangers resisted, fearing the dilution of their code or the corruption of their autonomy, the majority ultimately recognized that cooperation offered the best chance of survival and continued influence in a rapidly changing political landscape. The treaty itself codified a series of operational and moral agreements, ensuring that the Desert Rangers' core principles would be preserved even within the larger NCR military hierarchy, including the integration of their tactical doctrines, survival techniques, desert navigation skills, and small unit combat strategies, which had been developed over decades of independent operations and proven effective against raiders, hostile tribes, and environmental hazards alike, while simultaneously granting access to the Republic's logistical support, training facilities, armories, and intelligence networks, thereby creating a fusion of experience and resources that strengthened both organizations, though not without friction, as the Rangers had to reconcile their traditional independence with the bureaucracy, hierarchy, and political constraints of a centralized state, a compromise that tested their identity, morale, and commitment to the law of the wastes, forcing reflection on the meaning of justice, authority, and duty, when autonomy was ceded in exchange for longevity and support, and highlighting the ethical tension inherent in merging a principled, decentralized force with a political entity that operated under different imperatives, priorities, and pressures, yet valued the Desert Rangers' reputation, credibility, and operational expertise above all else. The process of unification involved extensive discussions on the chain of command, the role of individual autonomy, and the ethical limits of military action, as Desert Ranger leaders insisted that their units continue to operate with the same discretion and adherence to principle that had defined their operations for decades, including the protection of non-combatants, impartial judgment in disputes, and measured use of force, while NCR officials emphasized standardization, accountability, and integration into larger strategic objectives, a negotiation that required both parties to recognize the value of the other's approach and to identify a framework in which the Desert Rangers' ethos could coexist with NCR operational doctrine, and the resulting treaty established a unique hybrid structure, in which former Desert Ranger units retained a degree of operational autonomy, served as elite rapid response teams, and acted as moral exemplars within the NCR Ranger Corps, while contributing their specialized knowledge, leadership, and battlefield experience to the Republic's broader efforts to maintain order, secure territory, and protect civilian populations across the Southwest. The moral compromises inherent in the treaty were not insignificant. The Desert Rangers agreed to subordinate certain aspects of their independent authority to the Republic's strategic priorities, accept the limitations imposed by bureaucracy, and operate under political constraints that were previously foreign to a code-driven organization, a concession that weighed heavily on many who feared that their ethical principles would be compromised or diluted. Yet the long-term benefits included access to critical supply lines, reinforcements, intelligence networks, and formal recognition of their historical role, a combination that ensured the continuation of their legacy under changing conditions and allowed them to extend their influence and moral authority in ways that would have been impossible as an independent, under-resourced organization facing the growing threat of expansionist powers, raider networks, and environmental hazards, thus framing the treaty not merely as a political or military maneuver, but as a calculated, ethically informed decision to preserve the Rangers' mission, principles, and historical legacy, while adapting to a world in which autonomy alone was insufficient for survival and continued relevance. In practice, the merger required careful integration of personnel, doctrines, and traditions, including the formal adoption of Ranger training regimens, desert survival techniques, and combat strategies into NCR programs, while also preserving the symbolic and ethical heritage of the Desert Rangers, from their distinctive badges to their reputation for impartiality and moral clarity, a delicate balance that reinforced the continuity of the Rangers' identity, even as they became part of a larger, more structured military organization, and that allowed the NCR to leverage their prestige and credibility in newly acquired territories, where the population recognized the Desert Rangers' authority and trusted their judgment, thus facilitating the Republic's expansion, while ensuring that the core principles of the Rangers continued to influence operations, strategy, and the ethical culture of the newly unified force. The treaty's impact extended beyond operational considerations, influencing the culture, morale, and reputation of both organizations, as former Desert Rangers assumed leadership positions within the NCR Ranger Corps, trained new recruits, and maintained a visible standard of principled conduct, serving as living embodiments of the law of the wastes within a Republican framework, and reinforcing the idea that ethical enforcement, moral authority, and operational effectiveness could coexist even in a formalized military hierarchy, a lesson that would resonate throughout subsequent decades of NCR expansion and frontier governance, shaping both strategic doctrine and public perception of the Rangers as a disciplined, credible, and morally grounded force, capable of imposing order without resorting to the corruption, opportunism, or cruelty that characterized many other armed groups in the wasteland, and ensuring that the legacy of the Desert Rangers remained alive, respected, and influential, even as the organization itself ceased to exist in its original independent form. Ultimately, the Ranger Unification Treaty exemplifies the complex interplay of ethics, pragmatism, and strategy in the evolution of post-war organizations, showing how a principled, autonomous force can adapt to the demands of a centralized political entity while retaining its identity, influence, and moral authority, and how compromise, negotiation, and shared values can secure the survival, relevance, and legacy of an organization facing existential pressures, creating a model of integration that preserved the Desert Rangers' contributions, ethos, and operational excellence, while ensuring that the ideals they had cultivated over decades would continue to guide, inspire, and inform the NCR Ranger Corps and the broader reconstruction of the Southwest, solidifying a historical bridge between the independent lawmen of the desert and the institutionalized enforcers of the Republic, and demonstrating that even in the face of compromise, the core principles of justice, discipline, and moral clarity could endure, influence policy, and shape the future of the wasteland. After the historic merger of the Desert Rangers into the NCR Ranger Corps, their influence did not vanish, but instead reverberated across the Mojave Wasteland, manifesting in both the institutional culture of the new Ranger units and the broader social and political landscapes of the territories they patrolled. For the veterans who had once walked the deserts of Nevada and Arizona brought with them decades of experience, survival, knowledge, and moral authority that were now repurposed to enforce the laws, protect settlements, and stabilize trade routes under the banner of the new California Republic, a shift that allowed their principles to endure within a structured political framework, while also testing the adaptability of those principles to a rapidly evolving environment shaped by both human and environmental pressures, and by the confluence of diverse communities with competing needs and allegiances, such as independent settlers, emerging towns, nomadic traders, and tribal groups, all of whom had to be managed in a manner consistent with the ethical, disciplined, and impartial enforcement legacy that the Desert Rangers had established decades earlier. The Mojave became the proving ground for this integration, where outposts such as Camp McCarran, Hoover Dam, and New Vegas itself represented focal points for the exercise of Ranger authority, sites where the codification of training, tactical doctrine, and moral principles could be observed and tested in real-world operations, from safeguarding caravans against raider attacks to mediating conflicts between factions with divergent interests, ensuring that the lessons of survival, diplomacy, and ethical judgment acquired in the harsh deserts of the pre-NCR Southwest were applied to the unique challenges of a region marked by population density, political ambition, and the legacy of pre-war infrastructure and conflict. Veteran Desert Rangers who assumed leadership positions within NCR outposts carried forward not only technical knowledge and desert navigation skills, but also the intangible authority derived from a reputation for justice, impartiality, and ethical conduct, which they leveraged to maintain cohesion among recruits and to instill the values of the old order in the new generation of Rangers, a process that reinforced the continuity of the Desert Rangers' legacy even as operational methods were standardized within a Republic framework, and that ensured the preservation of a moral compass capable of guiding decisions in situations where bureaucratic pressures, political considerations, and survival imperatives could easily conflict, illustrating the enduring relevance of principle-driven enforcement in a post-apocalyptic frontier, and demonstrating how ethical authority could coexist with the structural advantages, supply lines, and strategic support of a centralized state, creating a hybrid force uniquely capable of stabilizing the Mojave under conditions that would have overwhelmed either autonomous rangers or purely bureaucratic military units operating alone. The echoes of the Desert Rangers' ethos were particularly visible in the handling of local conflicts, where NCR Rangers, drawing on their predecessors' experience, employed a balance of diplomacy, proportional force, and moral judgment to resolve disputes involving settlers, caravans, raider enclaves, and tribal communities, often preventing violence before it escalated, maintaining public trust, and solidifying the Republic's legitimacy in the eyes of the Mojave's population, a critical factor in an environment where loyalty and compliance could not be taken for granted, and where the ability to enforce order depended as much on credibility and fairness as on firepower. The influence of the Desert Rangers in the Mojave also extended to the training and doctrinal development of NCR Ranger units, as veterans embedded practical desert survival skills, small unit tactics, reconnaissance methods, and ethical decision-making into the curriculum of new recruits, ensuring that the capabilities which had once allowed independent rangers to operate effectively in isolated and hostile terrain were now codified, institutionalized, and widely disseminated, creating a core of highly skilled operatives who could respond to threats across a larger territory with consistency, discipline, and moral authority, while still retaining the flexibility and adaptability that had been the hallmark of the Desert Rangers' independent operations, and reinforcing the principle that operational effectiveness and ethical conduct were mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive, a lesson forged in decades of frontier hardship and carried forward into the Mojave through the integration of veterans and their teachings into the structures of the Republic. Strategically, the Mojave represented both an extension of the Desert Rangers' historical sphere of influence and a test of the merged organization's ability to project authority over a complex, contested environment, for the region was characterized by the convergence of multiple threats: raiders, slavers, rogue militias, remnants of pre-war factions, and politically ambitious entities, each of which required tailored responses informed by experience, intelligence, and ethical judgment. NCR Rangers, guided by the principles of the Desert Rangers, often had to act as mediators, negotiators, and enforcers simultaneously, balancing the immediate tactical requirements of conflict with the long-term necessity of preserving stability, public trust, and adherence to moral standards, illustrating the continued relevance of the Desert Rangers' ethos in a context where operational scale, political oversight, and social complexity had increased dramatically compared to the autonomous, small unit operations of their early years. The symbolic echoes of the Desert Rangers were also felt in the rituals, insignia, and morale of the Mojave NCR Rangers, who maintained badges, honor codes, and traditions that directly descended from the original order, and who internalized a culture of ethical responsibility, impartiality, and accountability as central to their identity. A cultural inheritance that reinforced cohesion, professionalism, and legitimacy in situations where authority might otherwise have been questioned or undermined, and ensured that the moral and operational lessons of the Desert Rangers were transmitted not as abstract ideals but as lived experience embedded in the daily routines, decisions, and practices of the new Ranger generation, extending the influence of the original order across time, geography, and political structures. Moreover, the Mojave experience demonstrated the practical benefits of the merger, as Desert Ranger veterans helped NCR forces navigate harsh desert terrain, maintain supply lines, and implement small unit tactics adapted to the environmental, social, and military conditions of the region, resulting in operational success that was both immediate and durable. from securing key trade routes and settlements to countering raider factions and mitigating interfactional disputes. A testament to the enduring value of field experience combined with principled leadership, and a demonstration that the ethos, knowledge, and moral framework of the desert rangers could be preserved and amplified within a larger, politically sophisticated military institution, enhancing both the efficiency and the legitimacy of governance in a challenging frontier. The Mojave outposts, Hoover Dam, and New Vegas became living monuments to this continuity, sites where the historical legacy of the Desert Rangers intersected with the political ambitions, military structure, and societal needs of the NCR, and where every patrol, negotiation, and operation served as a demonstration of how the principles, training, and moral authority cultivated in the independent deserts of Nevada, Arizona could be applied effectively under the auspices of a republic, guiding a new generation of rangers in the ethical enforcement of law, the protection of vulnerable populations, and the strategic projection of authority across a complex and often dangerous landscape, ensuring that the echoes of the Desert Rangers' legacy continued to resonate, shaping the culture, operations, and ethical standards of the NCR Ranger Corps, and reinforcing the notion that even within a centralized state, the values and experience of frontier lawmen could inform governance, inspire trust, and sustain justice in a post-apocalyptic world where lawlessness remained a constant threat. Ultimately, the Mojave demonstrates that the merger of the Desert Rangers into the NCR was not a dissolution of identity, but a transformation, one in which the principles, tactics, and moral authority of a legendary independent force were preserved, institutionalized, and amplified within the structures of a growing republic, allowing the ethos of the Rangers to endure, influence new generations, and shape the conduct of frontier law enforcement in ways that ensured that the conscience of the Old Southwest continued to guide the governance and moral judgment of the Mojave, illustrating that the spirit of the Desert Rangers, though no longer fully autonomous, remained alive, operational, and profoundly influential in the ongoing struggle to bring order, justice, and ethical clarity to a chaotic, post-apocalyptic world. The rise of Caesar's Legion cast a long and threatening shadow over the Mojave, reawakening fears that had defined the Desert Rangers' early years, and testing the ethical and operational frameworks that had been preserved and propagated through the NCR Ranger Corps, for the Legion represented not merely a military threat, but a philosophical and moral challenge, a society forged in brutality, slavery, and the uncompromising pursuit of domination under a single authoritarian will, contrasting starkly with the Desert Rangers' code of justice, impartiality, and protection of innocence, and forcing the newly unified Rangers to confront the tension between the values they had inherited and the demands of a modern, centralized, and politically complex state facing existential peril, as the Legion's expansion along the Colorado River and into the Mojave threatened trade routes, settlements, and strategic assets, while simultaneously challenging the ideological foundations of the Republic itself, highlighting the fragility of law and order in a region where the vacuum of power could be rapidly filled by tyranny, coercion, and fear. From the perspective of the NCR Rangers, many of whom were trained and guided by former Desert Rangers, the Legion's arrival demanded a recalibration of operational tactics, ethical decision-making, and strategic priorities, as conventional military engagement, guerrilla-style interdiction, and defensive posturing all had to be evaluated through the lens of principle, ensuring that the use of force remained proportionate, morally defensible, and consistent with the legacy of impartial protection of the weak, while simultaneously countering an opponent whose very philosophy glorified cruelty, domination, and the subjugation of civilians, creating a moral and tactical paradox in which every engagement was not only a contest of weapons and strategy, but also a test of ethical resolve, courage, and the capacity to maintain legitimacy under extreme duress. The Desert Rangers' influence was particularly evident in the NCR's approach to the Legion, as their historical experience in the deserts of Arizona and Nevada had taught that brute force alone could never secure long-term stability, and that strategic patience, intelligence gathering, negotiation, and the protection of non-combatants were essential to both ethical and operational success. And these lessons informed the deployment of Ranger units along critical points in the Mojave, including Fortification Hill, the Colorado River, and the approaches to Hoover Dam, where patrols, reconnaissance missions, and tactical interdictions were designed not only to slow or halt Legion expansion, but to maintain the moral high ground, preserve civilian loyalty, and model the disciplined, principled enforcement of law that had long defined the Desert Rangers' reputation, ensuring that even in the midst of war, the ethical standards of the original order continued to shape the behavior, decisions, and reputation of the Republic's forces. This moral framework was constantly tested, as Legion operations often involved mass intimidation, enslavement, and public executions, placing Rangers in situations where the immediate tactical advantage might suggest ruthlessness or expedience, but the long-term preservation of credibility, trust, and legitimacy demanded restraint, proportionality, and strategic adherence to principle, reflecting a continuity of Desert Ranger philosophy that emphasized justice, impartiality, and protection of innocence, even when faced with an adversary whose methods and objectives were diametrically opposed to those values. In operational terms, the NCR Rangers had to adapt rapidly to the Legion's unconventional and often brutal strategies, which included ambushes, forced marches, slavery of captured populations, and psychological warfare designed to intimidate, destabilize, and control, requiring the Rangers to integrate desert, reconnaissance, survival skills, small unit tactics, and intelligence operations developed during the Arizona campaigns, with the logistical support and strategic oversight provided by the NCR, creating a hybrid approach that combined autonomy, adaptability, and initiative with coordination, resources, and centralized command, and ensuring that Ranger units could respond effectively across a wide and complex operational theater, from the Mojave's harsh desert terrain to river valleys and strategic choke points, while maintaining the ethical standards and operational principles inherited from the Desert Rangers, demonstrating the enduring relevance of those decades-old doctrines in shaping contemporary military strategy and civil protection efforts against a profoundly different and ideologically extreme foe. The ideological confrontation between NCR values and Caesar's Legion philosophy had profound effects on both soldiers and civilians in the Mojave, as the presence of the Legion forced a reconsideration of what it meant to enforce law, protect life, and uphold morality in a context where the alternative was absolute tyranny, and where the costs of failure were measured in mass enslavement, terror, and widespread destruction. A scenario that demanded not only tactical acumen but also ethical clarity, leadership, and the capacity to make rapid, principled judgments in situations of profound moral complexity, qualities that were central to the Desert Rangers' ethos and that were now being tested on a broader scale within the framework of a political and military institution, illustrating the ongoing influence of the Rangers' legacy on the ethical culture, operational doctrine, and strategic decision-making of the NCR in the Mojave. The confrontation with Caesar's Legion also revealed the importance of the Rangers' training in diplomacy, negotiation, and psychological assessment, as indirect engagement, intelligence gathering, and the use of non-combative measures often proved as decisive as open battle, whether in convincing local tribes to resist Legion coercion, mediating disputes among settlements vulnerable to invasion, or identifying strategic weaknesses in Legion logistics, leadership, and morale, demonstrating that the ethical and operational principles developed over decades of independent Desert Ranger activity remained not only relevant but essential in confronting a new and morally complex threat, and underscoring the continued relevance of principle-driven enforcement in shaping the behavior, reputation, and effectiveness of military units operating in ethically fraught environments. Ultimately, the shadow of Caesar's Legion forced the NCR and its ranger units to confront the enduring challenge that had always defined the Desert Rangers' mission: the preservation of law, justice, and ethical governance in a world where human ambition, brutality, and chaos constantly threatened the social fabric, and where every engagement was both a tactical contest and a test of moral authority, requiring decisions that balanced immediate survival, strategic success, and the long-term preservation of ethical legitimacy, a dynamic that ensured that the echoes of the Desert Rangers' philosophy continued to shape the conduct, culture, and identity of the Mojave NCR Rangers, influencing not only military operations but the moral and political foundations of the Republic's presence in the region, demonstrating that even in the face of unprecedented tyranny, the principles forged in the ashes of the post-war Southwest could guide action, inspire courage, and preserve the legacy of justice that had defined the Desert Rangers since their inception, and proving that the conscience of the Old Southwest remained active, vigilant, and morally relevant, even under the looming threat of a ruthless, expansionist foe. The events of Honest Hearts in Zion National Park provide a profound lens through which to examine the enduring influence of the Desert Rangers' ethos, as the moral, strategic, and ethical principles cultivated in the Southwest deserts centuries earlier continued to echo far beyond the Mojave, shaping not only the conduct of the NCR Rangers, but also the broader moral landscape in which the people of Zion struggled to survive, rebuild, and assert agency in a world scarred by nuclear devastation. The arrival of Joshua Graham, the Burned Man, and former legate of Caesar's Legion, serves as both a narrative and historical bridge, linking the violent expansionism of the Legion with the disciplined, morally grounded approach of the Desert Rangers, and highlighting the central tension between revenge, mercy, and justice in the post-apocalyptic West, as Graham's personal odyssey of redemption mirrors the foundational principles of the Rangers' own Law of the Wastes, emphasizing accountability, ethical conduct, and the protection of innocence even when confronted with extraordinary brutality, moral ambiguity, and the desire for retribution, illustrating how the Ranger legacy transcended both geography and generational divides, to influence not only formal institutions like the NCR Ranger Corps, but also the moral choices and societal structures of independent communities living on the frontier. Zion itself, with its steep canyons, treacherous rivers, and isolated settlements, presented environmental and human challenges reminiscent of the early deserts of Arizona and Nevada, and the interactions between the player, the Dead Horses tribe, the Sorrows, and Joshua Graham exemplify the ethical and tactical dilemmas that the Desert Rangers had navigated for decades. The need to balance survival, strategic advantage, and moral responsibility in conditions of extreme scarcity, violence, and social complexity, where every action could carry consequences for entire communities, and where the lessons of impartiality, proportionality, and long-term stability, central to the Ranger Code, were essential to preventing the escalation of conflict into cycles of revenge and annihilation, reinforcing the idea that ethical enforcement of justice required not only courage and skill, but also wisdom, judgment, and the ability to empathize with and understand the motivations of diverse human actors. Joshua Graham's presence in Zion highlights the intersection between the Desert Rangers' philosophy and the broader moral framework of the wasteland, as he embodies both the consequences of unrestrained vengeance and the potential for redemption grounded in principle, demonstrating that the path of justice, even in a lawless environment, demands careful calibration between punishment and mercy, discipline and compassion, authority and restraint. These are the same tensions that shaped the operations, doctrine, and identity of the Desert Rangers, and they resonate in every decision faced by NCR Rangers and independent actors influenced by the Rangers' legacy, whether negotiating with tribes, confronting raiders, or adjudicating disputes among settlers, illustrating that the ethical challenges of frontier law enforcement are perennial, contextual, and deeply entwined with both survival and moral responsibility, and that the enduring legacy of the Desert Rangers lies as much in their codified principles and cultural authority as in their battlefield accomplishments, forming a template for principled action in the most ethically ambiguous and dangerous environments imaginable. The tactical realities of Zion further reflect the operational influence of the Desert Rangers, as survival in steep canyons, narrow passes, and isolated valleys requires specialized knowledge in navigation, supply management, reconnaissance, and small unit tactics, all of which were central to Ranger training and operations, and all of which were brought forward into the NCR and applied by operatives familiar with the Desert Rangers' methods, demonstrating the transference of expertise from one theater to another while adapting to the unique environmental and social conditions of Zion, where hostile raiders, competing tribal factions, and environmental hazards combined to produce a complex operational landscape, and where the lessons of flexibility, improvisation, and principle-driven engagement, hallmarks of the Desert Rangers' approach, proved critical to maintaining both security and legitimacy in the eyes of local communities. The narrative of Honest Hearts also emphasizes the psychological and ethical burdens that the Desert Rangers had historically carried, as players witness characters grappling with grief, loyalty, revenge, and moral compromise, echoing the same challenges faced by the original Rangers during the Arizona campaigns, the Mojave operations, and the negotiation of the Ranger Unification Treaty, and reinforcing the continuity of these moral and operational challenges across time, geography, and institutional contexts, showing that the principles of impartiality, accountability, and protection of innocence were not merely procedural rules, but deeply human imperatives, central to the ethical functioning of any frontier enforcer, whether independent, merged, or otherwise constrained by political or military hierarchies. Moreover, the events in Zion illustrate the ethical complexity of leadership and intervention in a world without centralized authority, as the Desert Rangers' approach emphasize that moral authority and operational capacity must coexist, and that decisions must account for long-term consequences for communities, relationships, and social cohesion, a lesson mirrored in Joshua Graham's leadership, the decisions of the player character, and the actions of the tribes, highlighting the ways in which the Desert Rangers' influence shaped not only formal institutions but also the ethical sensibilities, strategic choices, and survival priorities of communities operating on the frontier, creating a ripple effect in which the principles of law, justice, and protection propagated beyond the immediate jurisdiction of any single ranger unit, influencing moral reasoning and operational strategy in regions as distant and culturally distinct as Zion, and reinforcing the rangers' status as both practical enforcers and moral exemplars, whose legacy could be felt far from the deserts of Nevada and Arizona. The concept of mercy and proportionality, central to the Rangers' ethos, becomes particularly salient in Zion, as Joshua Graham's personal philosophy and the player's moral choices underscore the necessity of balancing punishment with restraint, justice with empathy, and strategic objectives with ethical responsibility, illustrating the enduring relevance of the Desert Rangers' moral training and operational doctrine, which had emphasized that true authority derives not from fear or domination, but from ethical clarity, consistent conduct, and principled decision-making in situations of ambiguity and extreme risk, a lesson continually reinforced by the NCR's integration of Desert Ranger veterans into field operations, training programs, and command structures, ensuring that these principles were not abstract ideals, but practical guides for action in environments as hostile, morally complex, and strategically challenging as the Mojave and Zion. Ultimately, Honest Hearts crystallizes the enduring legacy of the Desert Rangers by demonstrating that their philosophy, tactics, and moral principles transcend institutional boundaries, geographical regions, and even centuries, influencing both formalized military structures such as the NCR Ranger Corps and independent actors operating in remote, lawless, or morally ambiguous spaces, illustrating that the essence of the Rangers' contribution to post-apocalyptic society lies not solely in victories or patrols but in the cultivation of ethical reasoning, disciplined enforcement, and principled leadership, qualities that endure wherever justice is sought in the absence of law, that guide decisions in moments of peril, and that provide a model for the delicate balance between power, morality, and survival in a world defined by chaos, scarcity, and competing visions of civilization, thereby ensuring that the moral and operational echoes of the Desert Rangers remain active, influential, and deeply instructive in Zion, the Mojave, and beyond, proving that the conscience of the Old Southwest continues to shape the future of the wasteland. The iconic image of the Desert Rangers and their NCR successors, their dusters, gas masks, and wide-brimmed hats, often obscures the human reality of those who bore the responsibility of law enforcement, survival, and moral judgment across the wasteland. Yet behind every helmet lies a story of endurance, sacrifice, and ethical struggle, a reminder that the mythos of the Rangers was constructed not only from victories or patrols, but from the lived experience of individuals confronting isolation, danger, and the weight of responsibility in a world where chaos reigned, civilization was fragile, and every decision carried profound consequences for life, property, and moral authority, and that these human experiences, though often invisible in the uniform, shaped the conduct, culture, and ethical rigor of the Ranger Order, forging a personal and collective identity that balanced courage, discretion, and judgment under extreme conditions. The psychological toll of patrolling vast deserts, hostile canyons, and contested territories was immense. As Rangers endured long periods of solitude, exposure to environmental hazards such as extreme heat, radiation, and scarcity of food and water, and the constant threat of combat against raiders, mutated wildlife, and human aggressors, conditions that tested both mental resilience and physical endurance while demanding unwavering adherence to the law of the wastes, which required impartiality, protection of innocence, and proportional use of force, a moral and operational code that functioned as both compass and anchor in circumstances where ethical clarity could easily be compromised by fear, anger, or survival instinct, and where every mistake had the potential to undermine not only immediate missions, but the broader credibility and authority of the Ranger organization. Personal narratives and oral histories from veterans reveal the complexity of life beneath the helmet, showing that Rangers were forced to reconcile the tension between duty and emotion, between enforcement and empathy, and between the ideals of justice and the practicalities of survival, as encounters with settlers, tribal factions, and raider groups frequently presented moral dilemmas with no clear solution, such as deciding when to use lethal force, how to protect vulnerable populations, or whether to intervene in disputes that could escalate into violence. These decisions were rarely straightforward, often requiring rapid assessment of risk, loyalty, and long-term consequences, and the responsibility for these choices rested heavily on individuals whose identities were inseparable from both the reputation of the Desert Rangers and the ethical standards they upheld, emphasizing that the uniform was not merely protective clothing or a symbol of authority, but a mantle that carried profound moral and psychological weight, embodying the values, responsibilities, and sacrifices of every ranger who wore it. The loneliness of frontier patrols contributed to a unique social and psychological culture, where camaraderie, mentorship, and the bonds between small unit teams became essential for maintaining morale, mental health, and operational cohesion, and where the transmission of knowledge, experience, and ethical reasoning from veteran rangers to recruits ensured continuity of both skill and principle, reinforcing the idea that the human element, resilience, judgment, and moral clarity was as central to the success of the Rangers as any tactical innovation, weapon, or supply line, and that the true legacy of the organization was rooted as much in character and decision-making as in military or logistical accomplishment. Environmental storytelling within the wasteland, abandoned settlements, memorial markers, journals, and scattered remnants of past patrols offers further insight into the individual lives behind the Ranger helmet, revealing personal motivations, fears, and triumphs that humanize the myth, as these artifacts document moments of courage, loss, ethical reflection, and mentorship, demonstrating that the collective legend of the Rangers was constructed upon countless personal narratives that emphasized duty, restraint, compassion, and perseverance, and that the ethos of the Desert Rangers was perpetuated not merely through institutional training or codified law, but through lived experience, oral tradition, and the transmission of values from one generation of Rangers to the next, creating a moral lineage as enduring as any operational doctrine. The cumulative psychological burden of endless patrols, the necessity to make morally consequential decisions in isolation, and the constant exposure to violence and deprivation also reveal the resilience and adaptability of the human spirit within the post-apocalyptic context, highlighting how Rangers developed coping mechanisms, practical improvisation skills, and ethical frameworks that allowed them to operate effectively while preserving the integrity of their mission, reinforcing the notion that behind every symbol, the star-shaped badge, the duster, the gas mask, was a person making choices that shaped not only immediate outcomes, but the moral and operational legacy of the organization itself. The face beneath the helmet is also an exploration of identity, as Rangers navigated the tension between individual conscience and institutional responsibility, between personal morality and the demands of survival, and between fear and courage, learning to reconcile the human vulnerabilities inherent in life on the frontier with the ethical imperatives of impartial enforcement, protection of innocence, and adherence to the law of the wastes, a process that forged both character and reputation, and that allowed the Ranger Order to maintain legitimacy and authority even in the most chaotic environments. In doing so, these individuals became living embodiments of the ethical and operational ideals cultivated over decades of desert patrols, Arizona campaigns, and Mojave operations, carrying forward the principles of the Desert Rangers into every engagement, negotiation, and patrol, and ensuring that the organization's credibility was inseparable from the integrity, judgment, and humanity of its members. Personal accounts also reveal how Rangers grappled with the emotional cost of loss, of comrades, civilians, and moral certainty, learning to balance grief, anger, and the desire for retribution with the disciplined application of principle, a struggle that highlights the profound ethical dimension of their service and demonstrates that the operational success of the Desert Rangers depended as much on psychological resilience, ethical judgment, and personal integrity as on marksmanship, tactics, and survival skill, making each Ranger not only an enforcer of law but also a custodian of the moral legacy of the Order, whose actions would resonate across communities, generations, and institutions long after the individual patrol concluded. The psychological and ethical dimension of life beneath the helmet also underscores the importance of mentorship and collective culture within the Ranger Order, as veterans shaped the development of new recruits, imparting not only practical skills in navigation, reconnaissance, and combat, but also the subtle lessons of ethical reasoning, moral courage, and decision-making under uncertainty, ensuring that the next generation internalized both the operational expertise and the ethical framework that defined the Desert Rangers' identity, and that the human legacy of the Order, its capacity for principled action, impartial judgment, and protection of life, remained intact even as institutional structures evolved, military doctrines formalized, and the Republic's bureaucracy expanded, creating continuity between the experiences of autonomous frontier patrols and the more structured operations of the NCR Ranger Corps in the Mojave. Ultimately, the face beneath the helmet humanizes the myth of the Desert Rangers, reminding us that behind the symbols, uniforms, and reputations were men and women confronting extreme danger, moral ambiguity, and personal sacrifice, whose endurance, judgment, and ethical clarity ensured that the legacy of the Rangers remained credible, respected, and operationally effective, and that the conscience of the Old Southwest continued to influence decisions, conduct, and moral culture across the post-apocalyptic frontier, demonstrating that the true power of the Rangers lay not in their equipment, numbers, or victories, but in the courage, resilience, and principled action of the individuals who bore the weight of law, justice, and survival under the most unforgiving conditions imaginable, ensuring that the ethos, judgment, and humanity of the Desert Rangers would continue to resonate across generations, landscapes, and institutions, and proving that the legacy of the organization is inseparable from the faces, hearts, and minds of those who wore the helmet. The image of the NCR Ranger, with its dusters, gas masks, wide-brimmed hats, and star-shaped badges, represents more than practical attire or a symbol of authority. It embodies the enduring legend of the Desert Rangers, whose history, ethos, and operational excellence were distilled into a visual and cultural archetype that would resonate across the post-apocalyptic Southwest for decades, and whose impact shaped both real and imagined perceptions of law, justice, and frontier heroism, creating a mythology that blurred the lines between individual achievement, institutional authority, and popular narrative, a mythology reinforced through oral histories, in-game environmental storytelling, and formal NCR training, whereby the uniform served as a tangible reminder of the ethical principles, operational rigor, and historical legacy of the Desert Rangers, and as a visual shorthand for courage, impartiality, and moral clarity, qualities that had been cultivated over decades of independent operations in the harsh deserts of Arizona and Nevada, through conflicts with raiders, tribal factions, and environmental hazards, and through the ethical dilemmas inherent in maintaining order without the support of formal government, a combination of legend and lived experience that elevated the Ranger into both a practical and symbolic institution. The uniform itself evolved from necessity and practicality, as the deserts of the Southwest demanded protection from heat, radiation, dust, and sand, and the need for utility, mobility, and durability dictated design choices such as the long leather duster, reinforced boots, gloves, and the distinctive wide-brimmed hat, which shielded both identity and physical vulnerability. The gas mask, initially adopted for protection against irradiated zones, chemical hazards, and dust storms, became emblematic of the Rangers' resilience, self-reliance, and readiness to confront any threat, while the star-shaped badge, harking back to pre-war, sheriffs and lawmen, signified not only authority but an ethical commitment to impartiality, justice, and the protection of innocence, a moral contract between the wearer and the communities they served, ensuring that the image of the Ranger conveyed both operational capability and ethical integrity, and reinforcing the cultural perception of the Ranger as a guardian of law and morality in a world otherwise defined by chaos, scarcity, and the threat of violence. Myth-making surrounding the Desert Rangers was further amplified by their deeds, which became the foundation of stories, legends, and reputations that traveled faster than their patrols ever could, from the Mojave to Zion and beyond, creating a symbolic presence that extended far beyond their physical operations and demonstrating the interplay between actual achievement and cultural perception, where victories against raiders, the establishment of safe trade routes, ethical interventions in disputes, and acts of mercy or restraint were transformed into narrative archetypes, enhancing the perceived authority, moral legitimacy, and heroic status of the Rangers, and allowing the NCR to capitalize on these associations when incorporating the Desert Rangers into their official structures, recruitment, and propaganda, leveraging the myth of the uniformed ranger to inspire loyalty, confidence, and compliance, while simultaneously embedding the ethical and operational principles of the original order into the institutional identity of the Republic. The process of myth-making also served a practical function, as the legend of the Rangers, reinforced by the uniform, instilled both fear and respect in hostile actors, creating a psychological advantage in encounters with raiders, slavers, and rogue militias, and reducing unnecessary bloodshed, while simultaneously reinforcing confidence, cohesion, and morale among allies, settlers, and junior rangers, who recognize the symbolic authority and operational competence embodied in the attire, demonstrating that the material culture of the uniform was inseparable from the strategic, psychological, and moral dimensions of the Ranger's role, and that the iconic appearance was both a practical tool of enforcement and a vehicle for transmitting values, history, and reputation across the wasteland. The myth of the uniform, reinforced through visual symbolism, reputation, and narrative, thus functioned as a form of cultural authority, legitimizing the actions of individual rangers while embedding ethical and operational expectations into the collective consciousness of both allies and adversaries, illustrating the capacity of institutionalized symbolism to influence behavior, shape social perception, and codify values in environments where formal legal frameworks were weak or absent, a lesson the NCR carried forward as it integrated the Desert Rangers into its centralized structure. Environmental storytelling, in-game accounts, and historical artifacts further cemented the symbolic power of the uniform, from abandoned outposts and patrol journals to memorials and murals that honored Rangers' deeds, reinforcing the perception that the uniform was more than attire. It was a moral statement, an operational standard, and a cultural emblem, signaling both competence and ethical authority, and creating a visual continuity between independent Desert Rangers, NCR Ranger Corps members, and the aspirational ideal of frontier justice, heroism, and principled action, demonstrating that the uniform itself had become a repository of history, values, and collective identity, capable of inspiring, intimidating, and guiding behavior even in the absence of direct supervision or instruction, and ensuring that the Desert Rangers' influence persisted in both tangible and symbolic ways, long after the original units had ceased independent operations. The myth of the uniform also intersects with hero worship, propaganda, and media within the uniform/time wasteland, where tales of Ranger bravery, restraint, and ethical enforcement were recounted in settlement gatherings, broadcast via radio networks, and memorialized in public narratives, creating archetypes that shaped expectations, behavior, and public perception, reinforcing the social authority of Rangers and embedding their values into the moral fabric of frontier communities, illustrating how symbolism, ethics, and operational performance coalesced to produce a self-reinforcing cultural phenomenon in which the uniform represented not only personal and institutional identity, but the broader ideals of justice, discipline, and moral clarity in the wasteland, and demonstrating the durability of myth when grounded in consistent action, credible authority, and ethical principle. The continuity of myth and uniform also served as a bridge between generations, connecting the Desert Rangers' historical identity with the evolving NCR Ranger Corps and future operatives, allowing veterans to transmit knowledge, values, and practical expertise through mentorship, training, and exemplification, and ensuring that the image of the Ranger remained both aspirational and operationally relevant, embodying the convergence of ethics, skill, and cultural authority, and enabling successive generations to internalize the principles of impartiality, protection of innocence, and disciplined enforcement, even in the context of evolving political, social, and environmental conditions, demonstrating that the symbolic power of the uniform was inseparable from the lived experience, ethical rigor, and operational competence of those who wore it, and that legend and practicality reinforced each other in sustaining the identity and legacy of the Rangers across time, geography, and institutional transformation. Ultimately, the myth and the uniform illustrates how the Desert Rangers' image evolved into a cultural, ethical, and operational symbol, one that transcended individual achievement, institutional integration, and geographic boundaries, demonstrating that the duster, gas mask, hat, and badge were far more than attire. They were the visible manifestation of decades of principle-driven action, operational innovation, and moral authority, embodying the convergence of skill, ethics, and legend that ensured the Rangers' legacy persisted across the Mojave, Zion, and beyond, influencing not only the NCR Ranger Corps but also the perceptions, behaviors, and moral calculations of civilians, allies, and adversaries throughout the post-apocalyptic Southwest, proving that the myth of the uniform and the reality of the Ranger behind it were inseparable components of a lasting, morally grounded, and operationally effective institution whose shadow continues to define law, order, and justice in a world forged from the ashes of civilization. The decline of the original Desert Rangers within the NCR hierarchy represents a poignant and complex chapter in the evolution of post-war law enforcement, illustrating the inevitable tension between principled, decentralized frontier justice and the bureaucratic imperatives of a rapidly expanding republic, as the veterans who had once patrolled the deserts of Arizona and Nevada found their operational autonomy gradually curtailed, their authority subordinated to political oversight, and their ethical code challenged by the realities of institutional standardization, strategic priorities, and the administrative demands of a growing organization. For decades, the Desert Rangers had embodied a self-sufficient, morally driven, and highly skilled force, capable of enforcing justice in environments characterized by extreme isolation, hostility, and social fragmentation. Yet, as the NCR consolidated power, established garrisons, and formalized military and civil structures, the flexibility, independence, and local authority that had defined the Rangers became increasingly constrained, producing a subtle but profound erosion of influence and a generational shift in operational culture that emphasized compliance, protocol, and hierarchy over the intuitive, principle-driven decision-making that had once defined success on the frontier. This transformation was experienced as both a practical and an existential challenge, as many veterans struggled to reconcile decades of service grounded in autonomy and moral clarity with the realities of a structured, politically accountable organization in which operational decisions, disciplinary procedures, and resource allocation were subject to review, approval, and political oversight, often creating friction between the original ranger's commitment to impartial justice and the imperatives of strategic efficiency, public relations, and centralized control, a tension that illuminated the broader cultural and institutional struggle of integrating legendary frontier forces into the machinery of a modern state, while preserving the ethical and operational legacies that had made them effective and respected in the first place. The decline of the old guard was further compounded by generational turnover, as younger NCR Rangers, trained under standardized curricula, mentorship programs, and centralized doctrine, increasingly populated the field, bringing with them competence, loyalty to the Republic, and operational effectiveness, yet often lacking the lived experience, ethical calibration, and autonomous judgment honed through decades of desert patrols, guerrilla-style engagements, and moral decision-making under conditions of isolation and scarcity, creating a dynamic in which the historical expertise of the Desert Rangers was institutionalized but simultaneously rendered less visible, less directly influential, and less personally authoritative, a subtle but undeniable shift that reflected both the advantages and the costs of integration, and highlighted the challenge of preserving operational and ethical integrity amid structural expansion, bureaucratic rationalization, and the inevitable dilution of individual discretion. A challenge that was acutely felt as the Republic's administrative, political, and military priorities increasingly emphasized territorial control, resource management, and standardized enforcement over the improvisational, morally grounded, and deeply contextual approach that had defined the original Ranger order. Internal disillusionment accompanied this decline, as veterans observed the gradual replacement of principle-driven autonomy with procedural compliance, witnessed the politicization of operational decisions, and recognized that some of the moral latitude that had enabled them to protect settlers, negotiate disputes, and enforce justice impartially was being curtailed, often in favor of expediency, centralized authority, or the preferences of distant administrators, a phenomenon that generated frustration, resentment, and in some cases, withdrawal from active duty or reassignment to less prestigious posts, while also raising questions about the long-term sustainability of the Rangers' ethical and operational legacy, and highlighting the human dimension of institutional transformation, in which individuals accustomed to a high degree of responsibility and moral discretion confronted the limits imposed by organizational expansion, hierarchy, and political oversight. The psychological burden of this transition cannot be overstated, as those who had spent decades embodying the ideals of courage, impartiality, and principled enforcement were now forced to navigate an environment in which their experience, judgment, and ethical frameworks were mediated, constrained, or overridden by layers of bureaucracy, creating moral and operational tensions that reverberated through both field operations and organizational culture, and demonstrating that the decline of the old guard was as much a cultural and psychological phenomenon as it was an administrative or procedural one, affecting morale, identity, and the perception of legitimacy among both Rangers and the populations they served. Corruption, favoritism, and politicization of the NCR hierarchy further exacerbated the decline, as centralized authorities sometimes rewarded compliance over competence, political loyalty over ethical consistency, and expediency over principled enforcement, undermining the moral authority that had long been a hallmark of desert ranger operations, and contributing to a perception that the values which had made the rangers legendary were increasingly symbolic rather than operationally enforceable, creating a climate in which ethical vigilance, impartial judgment, and moral courage were tested not only by external threats, but by internal pressures, organizational inertia, and the compromises inherent in navigating a complex bureaucratic structure, and forcing veterans to adapt to new constraints while seeking ways to preserve the essence of their legacy through mentorship, training, and subtle reinforcement of principles within their units, a delicate balancing act that required both discretion and moral courage in an environment where the ethical latitude of the past was no longer fully available. The operational consequences of the old guard's decline were similarly significant, as the loss of autonomous decision-making and locally grounded judgment sometimes resulted in slower response times, less effective field tactics, and diminished adaptability in encounters with raiders, slavers, and other frontier threats, particularly in remote regions of the Mojave and its peripheral territories, where centralized oversight could not replace the nuanced situational awareness, improvisation, and desert-hardened expertise cultivated over decades by desert rangers, illustrating that the decline of institutional authority and operational influence was not merely symbolic, but had tangible effects on the Republic's ability to enforce order, protect civilians, and maintain legitimacy in contested or isolated areas, and underscoring the strategic costs of subordinating principle-driven, decentralized experience to the imperatives of bureaucracy, standardization, and political centralization. Despite these challenges, the decline of the old guard was not total. Many veterans continued to serve as mentors, moral exemplars, and advisors, embedding the ethical and operational lessons of the Desert Rangers into training programs, leadership doctrine, and the institutional memory of the NCR Ranger Corps, ensuring that while direct influence and operational independence were diminished, the foundational principles of the Rangers' ethos persisted, transmitted through narrative, practice, and institutional culture, creating a subtle but enduring form of legacy that influenced decision-making, recruitment, and ethical reasoning across the organization, and that preserved the historical identity of the Rangers, even as the external trappings of autonomy, discretion, and direct authority were curtailed by the growth of the Republic. Ultimately, the decline of the old guard illustrates the complex interplay of institutional growth, bureaucratic standardization, generational change, and ethical integrity, showing that even the most legendary and principled forces are subject to the pressures of political, organizational, and operational evolution, and that the challenge of preserving identity, influence, and moral authority in the face of expansion and centralization is both practical and existential, affecting not only operational effectiveness, but the psychological, cultural, and ethical dimensions of service, and reminding us that the legacy of the Desert Rangers was not only in the battles they fought or the law they enforced, but in the principles, judgment, and moral courage they embodied, which continued to shape the NCR, its rangers, and the broader post-apocalyptic Southwest, even as their direct authority and autonomy diminished under the inexorable pressures of statehood, bureaucracy, and institutional consolidation. The legacy of the Desert Rangers, symbolized by the star-shaped badge that adorned their dusters and helmets, extends far beyond the tactical and operational history of their patrols, outposts, and campaigns, permeating the moral, cultural, and institutional landscape of the post-apocalyptic Southwest in ways that demonstrate the enduring influence of principle-driven frontier justice, as the emblem of the star has become both a tangible artifact and an abstract symbol of impartiality, ethical rigor, and the protection of life in a world where law is fragile, scattered, and contested, representing a continuity of purpose that transcends generations, organizational boundaries, and geographical distance, and highlighting how the ethical, operational, and cultural achievements of the original Desert Rangers have persisted, adapted, and inspired subsequent actors, from the NCR Ranger Corps to independent settlers, tribal leaders, and itinerant heroes like the Mojave Courier, who navigate a morally complex landscape shaped by scarcity, danger, and competing visions of civilization. The star itself functions as a visual and cultural shorthand for the values the Rangers embodied: courage under adversity, impartial enforcement of justice, protection of innocence, and the disciplined application of principle in situations of extreme moral and operational ambiguity, qualities that are recognized not only by allies and recruits, but also by adversaries, and by the broader populations of the Mojave, Zion, and beyond, instilling both respect and fear, creating psychological leverage, and reinforcing the moral authority of those who bear it. A dynamic that echoes the early reputation building of the Desert Rangers in Arizona and Nevada, where deeds, symbols, and ethical conduct coalesced into a reputation that transcended individual identity and became a foundational element of frontier governance, law, and social cohesion. The legacy of the star is not merely symbolic, it is operational, ethical, and instructive, providing a moral framework that guides the conduct of individuals and institutions alike, demonstrating that even as the NCR expanded, formalized, and bureaucratized, the principles enshrined in the original Desert Rangers ethos, protection of the vulnerable, impartiality in the application of justice, measured use of force, and ethical discernment under duress, remained relevant, informing decisions in tactical engagements, negotiations, and law enforcement operations, and ensuring that the core values of the Rangers were transmitted through both mentorship and institutional culture, embedded in training programs, codes of conduct, and field practices that have shaped generations of Rangers and civic leaders, reinforcing the idea that the moral authority of the Desert Rangers endures through practice, example, and cultural recognition, even in the absence of direct historical continuity, and illustrating the dual nature of their legacy as both a set of lived experiences and a repository of ethical guidance applicable across diverse circumstances. Independent settlers, militias, and frontier communities have also absorbed the lessons and inspiration of the star, using it as a standard for conduct, a symbol of moral legitimacy, and a benchmark for ethical judgment in contexts where formal governance structures are weak, absent, or contested, demonstrating that the Desert Rangers' influence extends beyond formal military or law enforcement structures into the social and cultural fabric of frontier society, shaping behavior, expectations, and ethical norms across settlements, caravans, and tribal groups, and ensuring that the principles of justice in the absence of law are internalized, transmitted, and applied by a broad array of actors who interact with, emulate, or recognize the authority of the star. creating a distributed form of moral and operational influence that persists even in the most remote or independent communities. The star's influence is further amplified through the stories, legends, and environmental histories preserved in the wasteland. Patrol journals, memorials, abandoned outposts, oral histories, and recorded testimonies all reinforce the symbolic and practical authority of the desert rangers, perpetuating a culture in which the values and principles of the original order are both instructive and aspirational, shaping behavior and decision-making while maintaining continuity with the historical foundations of frontier law, justice, and ethical enforcement. Within the NCR, the star serves as a tangible link between institutional authority and the historical and moral foundation of the Ranger Corps, reminding recruits, commanders, and veterans alike of the responsibilities, standards, and ethical imperatives embedded in their mission, and providing a visual and cultural reinforcement of the code of conduct inherited from the Desert Rangers, demonstrating that the efficacy of the NCR Ranger Corps is inseparable from the ethical and operational lessons distilled over decades of autonomous frontier operations, and ensuring that the moral authority, reputation, and practical effectiveness of the Rangers are mutually reinforcing, transmitted through both formal structures and informal culture, and validated through the tangible outcomes of principled enforcement, protection of civilians, and judicious use of force. The star is thus a nexus of memory, identity, and instruction, linking the historical accomplishments of the Desert Rangers to the ongoing work of maintaining security, stability, and ethical governance in a wasteland defined by both scarcity and danger, and representing a continuity that spans decades of post-apocalyptic history, connecting the trials, decisions, and sacrifices of the original patrols to contemporary moral, strategic, and operational imperatives, and highlighting the enduring relevance of the Rangers' principles across time, geography, and institutional evolution. The symbolic power of the star also functions as a psychological and cultural tool, reinforcing trust among allies, inspiring loyalty in new recruits, and deterring aggression from raiders, slavers, and other adversaries, who recognize the reputation of the Desert Rangers and the ethical authority it conveys. A legacy built not through coercion alone, but through consistent demonstration of competence, principle, and impartiality, which transformed individual reputations into collective cultural capital, enabling the Rangers and those influenced by them to exert authority, maintain stability, and promote ethical behavior in situations where formal law and governance are weak or contested, and ensuring that the principles of justice, protection, and moral accountability remain embedded in the social fabric of the wasteland, even as individual actors, settlements, and institutional arrangements evolve. Furthermore, the star's legacy is deeply intertwined with individual moral agency, as characters such as the Mojave Courier, Joshua Graham, and independent settlers confront choices in which the principles of impartiality, ethical enforcement, and protection of innocence guide their decisions, demonstrating that the Desert Rangers' influence extends beyond formal military or governmental structures into the broader ethical culture of the wasteland, shaping decision-making, conduct, and the moral horizon of actors who must navigate the complex interplay of survival, morality, and authority, and ensuring that the ethos of the Desert Rangers continues to inform action and judgment wherever the star is recognized, emulated, or revered. Ultimately, The legacy of the star demonstrates that the Desert Ranger's impact transcends tactical success, institutional integration, and geographic presence, encompassing moral, cultural, and psychological dimensions that continue to shape the Southwest, the Mojave, Zion, and beyond, illustrating that the principles, judgment, and ethical authority embodied in the star are as enduring as they are influential, and proving that the ethos, reputation, and legacy of the Desert Rangers live on, not merely in history or myth, but in the ongoing actions, decisions, and moral reasoning of all who recognize the meaning of the star, ensuring that the conscience of the Old Southwest continues to guide, inspire, and constrain behavior in a world still recovering from the devastation of the Great War. The final chapter of the Desert Rangers' history, The Last Patrol, chronicles the twilight of an institution that had once embodied the ideals of law, order, and principled enforcement in the harsh and chaotic landscapes of the post-apocalyptic Southwest, tracing the last vestiges of independent ranger activity as their numbers dwindled. Their outposts were absorbed into the NCR, and their direct authority was replaced by bureaucratic structures, while simultaneously celebrating the enduring spirit, ethos, and legacy that ensured the Desert Rangers never truly vanished, but instead became a moral and operational conscience for the wasteland, a symbol and guide for future generations of lawmen, settlers, and independent actors navigating the complex interplay of survival, justice, and ethical responsibility in a world still scarred by the Great War, where every decision, patrol, and intervention carried the weight of both immediate consequence and historical resonance, and where the enduring principles of courage, impartiality, protection of innocence, and disciplined judgment continued to influence the moral and operational culture of both the NCR Ranger Corps and the communities they once served independently. As the Republic expanded its control over the Mojave, Arizona, and Nevada, the autonomous Desert Ranger outposts that had defined the early decades of the Southwest frontier were gradually consolidated, leaving only scattered patrols, isolated veterans, and ceremonial stations to maintain a tangible link to the original order. Yet the memory of these patrols, their deeds, and the ethical rigor they enforced persisted in both recorded histories and oral tradition, ensuring that the lessons, principles, and reputation of the Desert Rangers were transmitted to those who would inherit the responsibility of maintaining order, ethical enforcement, and community protection, whether within formal NCR structures or in independent settlements, and demonstrating that the Rangers' influence extended far beyond the physical boundaries of their patrols, embedding itself into the moral and operational DNA of the region. The Last Patrol also emphasizes the human dimension of this transition, revealing the personal sacrifices, psychological burdens, and moral challenges endured by the remaining veterans who continued to patrol remote territories, mentor younger rangers, and uphold the ethical standards of the Desert Rangers even as their authority, resources, and numbers waned, highlighting the profound commitment required to maintain justice in the absence of law, the courage demanded by constant exposure to violence and environmental hazards, and the moral discipline necessary to apply force with restraint and fairness in situations where oversight was minimal and the stakes could not have been higher. These final patrols were often exercises in endurance, improvisation, and ethical judgment, testing the same principles that had defined the Rangers' founding decades, and demonstrating that the measure of their legacy lay not only in strategic victories, territorial defense, or institutional integration, but in the consistent application of principle, the maintenance of credibility, and the transmission of ethical and operational knowledge to future generations, even in the face of personal risk, fatigue, and the erosion of institutional autonomy. Environmental storytelling, abandoned outposts, and the scattered records left behind by the last desert rangers offer poignant evidence of both decline and continuity, documenting moments of heroism, ethical decision-making, and moral perseverance, and providing a tangible connection between the origins of the Rangers in the chaotic post-war deserts of Arizona and Nevada, and the operational and ethical culture of the NCR, the Mojave settlements, and independent communities across the wasteland. These remnants serve as both memorial and guide, illustrating how the principles of the Desert Rangers, impartiality, courage, protection of innocence, and ethical enforcement of justice, can be sustained and applied across generations, geographic regions, and institutional contexts, even as the direct, autonomous operation of the original Ranger unit ceases, demonstrating that the essence of the Order persists wherever its values are recognized, emulated, and enacted. The last patrol also highlights the symbolic function of the Desert Rangers as a moral touchstone, reinforcing the notion that even as institutional structures, numbers, and field authority diminish, the ethical and cultural influence of the Rangers endures, guiding decisions, shaping expectations, and providing a standard against which actions, conduct, and operational behavior can be measured. Veterans of the Order, their descendants, and those trained under their mentorship continue to embody these principles, ensuring that the legacy of courage, impartiality, and ethical enforcement remains present across the Mojave, Zion, and beyond, and demonstrating that the Desert Rangers' contribution to frontier justice was not solely tactical or operational but profoundly moral, establishing a framework for principled action that survives long after the patrols themselves have ended. Moreover, the last patrol illustrates the interplay between myth, memory, and practice, as the legend of the Desert Rangers, codified in symbols like the star-shaped badge, the duster, and the gas mask, persists alongside concrete ethical, operational, and strategic practices, allowing the influence of the Rangers to continue in both tangible and symbolic forms. This duality ensures that the ethos of the Rangers informs decisions, inspires courage, and guides conduct, even among actors who never served directly under the original Order, and underscores the unique capacity of a morally and operationally disciplined force to extend its influence far beyond the lifespan of its original units, creating a living legacy that operates as both an ethical compass and an operational template for those navigating a world defined by chaos, scarcity, and moral ambiguity. Ultimately, the last patrol serves as both eulogy and celebration, acknowledging the physical and operational decline of the Desert Rangers, while affirming the enduring vitality of their legacy, demonstrating that the spirit of the Order persists not only in NCR structures, settlement culture, and independent moral actors, but in the very conceptualization of frontier justice, ethical enforcement, and principled decision-making in a post-apocalyptic world, proving that the Desert Rangers never truly vanished. They became the conscience, the standard, and the guiding star of the wasteland, a moral and operational force whose influence continues to shape the actions, judgments, and ethos of the Mojave, Zion, and beyond. ensuring that the lessons forged in the ashes of the Southwest remain alive, relevant, and active in shaping the future of law, justice, and human conduct in a world that continues to wrestle with the consequences of the Great War.